Hello, friends. I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, and welcome to We the People, a weekly show of constitutional debate. The National Constitution Center is a nonpartisan nonprofit chartered by Congress to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people. In this episode of We the People, I'm speaking with best-selling author, philanthropist, and NCC trustee David Rubenstein about his new book, The Highest Calling: Conversations on the American Presidency. The book features interviews with presidential historians and U.S. presidents, and it chronicles the journeys of the leaders who have defined America. Enjoy the conversation. Hello, friends. It is so wonderful to be in person and to convene here at the beautiful National Constitution Center. What an exciting time, from the presidential debate to Constitution Day on Tuesday. It is just nonstop constitutional illumination. Friends, it's such a pleasure to share with you a great American historian, philanthropist, and friend of the NCC. David Rubenstein has done so much to spark curiosity about American history through his philanthropy, his scholarship, and his interviews. And among his many talents is he's a marvelous interviewer, as you know from his TV shows, and he just loves presidential history. I do too. I bet you do too, because you're here. And I just had the best day just devouring this book, which consists in interviews with great American presidential historians on American presidents, as well as interviews with three living presidents: George W. Bush, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump. Please join me in welcoming David Rubenstein.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, thank you very much for inviting me here, and happy to be here. You've done a great deal for the Constitution, and I've never met anybody who is enthusiastic about the Constitution as Jeff Rosen. As anybody, no founding father, nobody has as much enthusiasm as you do for the Constitution.
Well, you have great enthusiasm for American history and American presidents, and you say that one of your goals in writing the book was to spark curiosity and inspire people to learn more about American presidents. Tell us why you wrote the book.
Well, as a young man, I did work in the White House for President Carter, and I've lived in Washington for the ensuing 40-plus years. And so I hang around Washington, and you get to meet presidents from time to time. And I've always been interested in the presidency since I was a boy. And so I would say I really wanted to do this because I have an interest in this subject matter, but I hope that I could interest people into learning more about presidents. Right now, we have about 160 million people who vote in presidential elections, but 80 million people who are eligible to vote don't vote. 80 million people. And so I think our democracy would be stronger if you had another 80 million people voting, or 20 million more, some more than we have. So we have one of the lowest percentages of voting of any Western democracy, and I think my book alone is not going to change that, but I'm hoping that more and more people will get to learn more about the presidents. The debates that you hosted here the other night, the debate was a good step in that direction, but we need to get people more educated. As you know, Jefferson said, a representative democracy works best if you have an informed citizenry. And sometimes our citizenry is not as informed as it should be.
It is not, and you have done a great service in inspiring people to learn more. I want to talk about individual presidents, because what's so riveting about the book are the anecdotes that stick in the mind about human stories, about particular ones. But I do want to ask some broad questions about what struck you as common themes. I was struck by what deep readers of history many of these presidents were, from Lincoln, Garfield, FDR, Truman, JFK, Nixon, George W. Bush, Obama, Clinton, Carter. All of them are deep students of American history. Were you struck by that, and how is that reflected in their presidencies?
Well, when you work in the Oval Office, you say, wait a second, how am I sitting in the same building, more or less, that Lincoln was at, or other great presidents, Jefferson, other people? And you do get a sense that you're a part of history, and I think a lot of presidents really want to learn more about their predecessors, so they tend to read about it. And when you talk to some presidents, they actually know a lot about history because they've read about it, because they're occupying a very unique job. I call this the highest calling. That was a disappointment to some people, because I have said for many years the highest calling of mankind is private equity. And But I'm now going to revise that and say the highest calling in the private sector is private equity, but in the public sector, the highest calling is the presidency. And I start the book, my background in working in the White House and so forth as a young man who really wasn't qualified to work there. But the part of the book that I kind of talk about how the presidency did become the highest calling was really when Woodrow Wilson became president and after that. Now, let me explain. When George Washington was president, it's a great thing. He was a great leader, but nobody around the rest of the world that focused on George Washington. Even when Lincoln was president, he wasn't a world leader. He was known and admired, but not a world leader. But when Wilson went to Paris to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, when he entered Paris, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people cheering him. We'd never seen a U.S. president treated that well abroad. Most presidents never had gone abroad. He spent 6 months in Paris, and it became clear then that the president was the most important person, certainly in the Western world and maybe in the world. And then while his successors were less significant, let's say around the world, Harding and Coolidge and Hoover, when Roosevelt became president and we went into the Great Depression and we went into World War II, he became the leader, in effect, that Wilson had been. And ever since that time, whoever is president of the United States, even if they're low-key like Harry Truman, they are the most important person in the world. And when I go around the world and on business trips, people ask me more than anything else, tell me what's going on in the presidency, what's going on in the White House. People have an obsession with it because although we have 7 billion people on the face of the earth, the people who around the world want to know what the president's going to do because it's going to affect them more than any other person can affect them. So we have great inventors and we have great people that create internet-related companies and maybe devices that all of us use. But the life of most people around the world is probably going to be affected more by what the President of the United States does than by any other single person. And that's why it's really the highest calling. And that's why so many people who are so ambitious and want to help their country decide to become president. And I'll just final point on this. Why should somebody want to be president? Think about this. John Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson was driven out of office. Richard Nixon had to resign. Gerald Ford couldn't get reelected. Jimmy Carter couldn't get reelected. Ronald Reagan was almost assassinated and then had the scandal of Iran-Contra. George Herbert Walker Bush couldn't get reelected. Bill Clinton had the impeachment and so forth. Donald Trump was impeached twice. So why do people want this job where to get it, you have to spend 2 years of your life basically running around the country begging for money, bad hotels, bad food, no exercise, no family time. Why do people want this? Because I think they feel it is an obligation to give back to the country, and this is the best way to give back to the country. And I think a lot of very talented people have tried to get this job, and sadly, we don't get as many people trying to get it as I think we should. And final point, I would say the real final point is, when this country started, 1776, we had 3 million people in this country, 3 million people. 500,000 of them were slaves, and they couldn't be in government. 1.25 million were women. They weren't allowed in government. 10,000 were Jewish. They couldn't be in government. There were 500,000 people who were white Christian men who didn't own property, so they couldn't be in government. So you got about 400,000 people who could be in government and serve. And out of that, you got George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Monroe, James Madison. Think about that. Plus, not to mention Hamilton and Franklin. Why did we have such great leaders then, and now we have less? And my theory is the really talented people in our country now go into private equity. That's my theory.
Is it right that the current folks are that much less talented? When I read the depth of reading of, take the most recent ones, from Clinton to W. Bush to Obama, those three, and H.W., who you knew well, you say could have been one of the founders. On balance, it struck me that our recent presidents have been better than I thought. What do you think? Just in general, in terms of being prepared, scholarly students of history, about as good as you might hope for in a democracy.
You mean the people today?
The relatively recent people today were a pretty good bunch.
The people that become president today are reasonably prepared because we get people who have come out of government and they've been around typically. Donald Trump is an exception. I think people are reasonably prepared, but nobody can really be prepared. Nobody can be prepared. I don't care if you're George Herbert Walker Bush, you're vice president for 8 years, or Joe Biden, vice president for 8 years. There's nothing like sitting behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office and having to make the decision yourself. And every decision that comes to the president is a very difficult one. I would have gotten decided earlier. So it's a really tough job, and it ages these people. I mean, you can see, look at the age, when Barack Obama became president at the age of 47, he had no gray hair. And he left with a lot of gray hair. It ages you. It's a tough job. And, I have to say, we don't pay our people that much as President of the United States, but obviously they make money after they leave and the way our system now works. But it is amazing how, you get some talented people coming to the fore, and it is amazing how the American people take the election reasonably seriously. I just wish more people would take it seriously because, again, 80 million people don't vote that could vote.
One other general question, how much does character matter? You mentioned Wilson. Of course, his reputation has plummeted largely because he resegregated the federal government and the degree of his white supremacism and racism. Is it being on the wrong side of history, or is character important in defining whether you're a success?
Well, of course, being on the wrong side of history is something that changes the view of some of our presidents. So, for example, Woodrow Wilson was honored by the Democratic Party as a progressive leader for a long time. President of Princeton, New Jersey governor, and then just 2 years after he had been elected New Jersey governor, becomes president of the United States. But as president of the United States, he resegregated the workforce in Washington, D.C., which was a reflection of the fact he'd grown up in a segregated South, and he was growing up during the end of the Civil War period of time. So he resegregated the workforce. He also deceived the American people by really being very injured and having a stroke, and his wife was really effectively the president for the last 18 months. Take Jackson. We used to have Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners. That was the Democratic Party. Jackson now is vilified a lot in the Democratic Party because he was seen as an out-and-out racist and a person who drove Native Americans out of their homes and killed a lot of them and didn't seem to worry about it very much. In Jefferson's case, while he's still honored, we still have the Jefferson Memorial and we have Monticello, and I've been being a big contributor to both of those. Jefferson is now recognized for having been an owner of more than 600 slaves, and he had a relationship with a slave where he had at least 6 children with Sally Hemings. And it's an interesting story. We have a chapter in the book about it. Sally Hemings, it wasn't uncommon for slave owners to have relations with their slaves. That was very common, honestly, very, very common. So Jefferson was unique in that regard. But why did he pick this one woman to want to have this relationship with? It went on for more than 20-some years. Well, the reason is really this. When his daughter, he had 2 daughters who lived to past childhood, and when one of them was with him and when he was in France, he wanted the other one to come over. She was too young when he first went there. When she was 9 years old, he sent for her because another younger daughter had died. He wanted the other daughter to come to him. So when the instructions went to Monticello, they sent a slave woman to take the child to originally to London, then to Paris. And that slave woman was Sally Hemings. And she was 14. The age of consent in Virginia, by the way, at that time was 12. It had been up from 10. So she's there, 14 years old. Why did Jefferson fall in love with her so much, or whatever the relationship was? Well, because Jefferson's wife, who had died when Jefferson was 39 years old, on her deathbed, she said, "Don't marry again. I don't want any stepmother for my daughters. I had a bad stepmother." Jefferson said, "Okay, I won't." So he never actually married again. But Thomas Jefferson's wife's father was a man named John Wayles, W-A-Y-L-E-S. John Wayles was a slave owner. He had impregnated a slave, and the result was Sally Hemings. So when Jefferson saw a 14-year-old Sally Hemings who was 3/4 white, he was seeing what his wife looked like at the age of 14 because she was 3/4 white, and he had never seen his wife as a teenager. And so I think he probably fell in love with her, and he had a deal with her that said, "If you come back with me, all the children we have, I will free them upon my death," which he did. He didn't free her because it was rumored that he had this relationship, and he didn't want to, in fact, help it along. So when he died, he didn't free Sally Hemings because in Virginia, if you stayed in the same state that you were a resident of, Virginia, and you were freed slave, you had to go before the legislature to get approval of your staying there. And he obviously didn't want the discussion of his relationship with Sally Hemings. So she actually was released, in effect, from slavery by Jefferson's daughter. But so Jefferson has a different history now. We love Jefferson in many respects because of the Declaration of Independence, other things he did, and the President of the United States. He was an incredible president, but he did have this relationship with today, and he was a slave owner, and he measured very precisely the value of each of his slaves, how much money he was making from each of them, and so forth. So, history changes, and we look at people differently. But there are 2 presidents that I'll just mention whose reputations have soared, I think, in recent years. One of them is Harry Truman. He was kind of ridden out of Washington, very unpopular, seen as not up to the